Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming this afternoon. Giving up the last day of summer. Before winter, I guess. Anyway, the Council on Aging, the 501c3 nonprofit organization that helps support the Senior Center, is pleased to present to you this afternoon Jessica Michna from, well, she really doesn't need any introduction for a lot of us. We've seen her before and she's amazing, so we're just happy to have her back. There was a long stretch during COVID where that couldn't happen, so we're glad to have her back. We just have a couple of announcements for you. One is, if you didn't sign in at the touchscreen computer in the back when you came in, please do so on the way out. And if you don't have a card that allows you to sign in, just stop and talk to Ann or Kathy behind the desk, and they'll just record that you were here. We like to know how many people come to attend these things. And the other thing I would like you to know is that if you are inclined to make a donation towards the cost of the program on your way out, there's a gray metal box there with a green card standing out of it that says Program Donations Welcome. It helps offset the cost of having events like the one we have today to enjoy. So without any further ado, let's go back in time and enjoy Carolyn Ingalls.
Well, a very good afternoon to you. I am so pleased that you could come visit with me this afternoon and to travel such a long way, all the way to De Smet in the Dakota Territory. I'm pleased that the weather has cooperated with your travels. Oh, I have been so busy. I have been sewing and crocheting and knitting for weeks, preparing for this Christmas season. And this Christmas of 1886 is going to be a very special Christmas for the Ingalls family. For just a few days ago, my sweet dear daughter, Laura, little half pint, why, she has presented us with a little baby granddaughter. They've named her Rose. Oh, she is a beautiful little baby girl. And of course, I am very objective about that. Oh, I'm so pleased that everything has gone well for Laura and for her dear husband, Almanzo. I'm sure you all remember Laura and Almanzo. They were married just about a year and a half ago, and they live in that lovely little gray farmhouse. You passed it when you're coming up here to De Smet. Oh, it's going to be a wonderful Christmas. And just this morning, one of my neighbors stopped by and she brought me a lovely gift. Mrs. Jarsma. Now, Mrs. Jarsma and her husband, they are from a place in Bohemia. And she brought me a very special gift. She brought me these beautiful little gingerbread men. They are so precious. I haven't the heart to take a bite out of one. They're so adorable. But Mrs. Jarsma, she told me quite a bit about gingerbread. I didn't realize that it was something that has been made for centuries and centuries in Europe. She said it goes back probably to the Middle Ages or even before. That was a time when spices such as ginger and black pepper, as we know it, were just coming into Europe, and people were amazed at the difference it made in their food. And some very creative chefs and bakers, well, they created gingerbread. Now, Mrs. Jarsma told me the original gingerbread that was made all those hundreds of years ago, why, they started with stale or even moldy bread. Apparently, they felt that the mold on the bread gave it some very special flavor. Well, they would start with this moldy bread, and the baker would grind that bread until it was almost like a flour. And into that bread, they would add honey, milk, pepper, and ginger. And then they would spread this rather soggy sort of dough out onto a long sheet, and only maybe a half-inch thick, and they'd spread it all out, and they would let it dry for maybe 2 or 3 months. So you'd have to prepare this long before the Christmas season. But they would just let it dry thoroughly. And when it was dry, they would break or carve off pieces of it and serve it just like that. It was served as part of the meal. And Mrs. Jarsma pointed out also, it wasn't the common folk who could afford to have this gingerbread. They certainly couldn't afford to buy the spices and so on that was necessary for it. But it started catching on, and as the years went, as recipes do, they were enhanced and changed and even went through an evolution. And finally, she said by the, about the 18th century, the 1700s, in Europe, it had evolved into somewhat of what we think of gingerbread today. Very sweet and very spicy. But it was only the very wealthy, of course, who could afford all that ginger and spice and honey. Well, during that time, according to Mrs. Jarsma, the very wealthy ladies of the upper classes of society, why, they began taking this gingerbread and building it into gingerbread houses. Some were quite fanciful, or some even mimicked the house that they lived in. They made castles and chateaus and all sorts of very fanciful designs. And it just kept growing among all of the wealthy ladies in what we know as Austria and Germany and Bohemia. And very soon the ladies started to compete with one another, as ladies will do. And it was, well, who could build the largest and who could build the most fanciful and the most extravagant gingerbread houses. Eventually, there were times when these houses that the ladies built would fill an entire room in their castle or their mansion. And they'd impress their guests during the Christmas season by inviting them to come in and tour this magnificent creation of gingerbread. And so today we still have folks who make some very fanciful gingerbread houses and so on. And Mr. Jarsma told me part of that goes back to some old fairy tales that were told to him when he was just a child about a witch who lived in a gingerbread house and captured little children in the forest. It was a warning that the children shouldn't be wandering off into that forest for fear they would meet up with that witch who lived in a beautiful gingerbread house. And speaking of Mr. Jarsma, now by trade, he is a blacksmith. And he does very well. There's always plenty of work for Mr. Jarsma to do. But a few years ago, I think perhaps 2 or 3 years ago, Mr. Jarsma opened a general store over in Columbia. I'm not sure you're familiar with Columbia. It's about 10 miles from De Smet here. Well, he opened this general store, and at that time he was selling mostly seed and animal feed and a few other items. But now, I've heard, I've not been there as yet, but I have heard from some of my neighbors that he has wonderful things that he's brought in all the way from Chicago, and he even has raisins, and they're all the way from Spain. So I'm very excited to see Mr. Jarsma's general store before this Christmas season is done, and perhaps even buy a handful of those raisins. I imagine that they're quite pricey and dear, so I suppose all I'll be able to buy is just a handful. Excuse me. But Mr. Jarsma was telling me just a few weeks ago, he was telling me about a tradition that dates back many, many hundreds of years in the village that he grew up in Bohemia. And you see, the Jarsmas, they're Roman Catholic. And in fact, we have a new Catholic church here in town. And in fact, on Christmas Eve this year, it will be the first time that a priest will be coming here to have a service there. So we're going to have a very special celebration with our Catholic friends and neighbors. Well, as I was saying, Mr. Jarsma said that when he was a child, on Christmas Eve, a beautiful large pine tree was placed inside the church. And on the pine tree would be placed gloves, a pair of gloves. You see, the young men of all the surrounding villages would bring a pair of gloves. Oh, they weren't just any gloves. They'd have to be very, very lovely, and some of them very expensive. Many might be embroidered with precious metallic threads or fur lined. You see, because as the young men would hang his pair of gloves upon that tree, well, after the service on Christmas Eve, the young ladies of the surrounding villages would come up to the tree and select a pair of gloves. And so I'm sure all the young men had their fingers crossed that their particular favorite lady would come up and select his gloves. And Mr. Jarsma thought that was a very lovely idea, but he wanted to take it just a step further. I'm sure you've noticed when you were coming up here to Smet, we don't have a lot of pine forests here in North Dakota. So Mr. Jarsma, he made his own tree. As I say, he is a blacksmith. And his thought was that all the ladies in the surrounding towns and villages and farms, why, they could donate a pair of mittens. And on Christmas Eve, the children of the towns and villages and farms will be able to come up to the tree and select a pair of mittens to keep their hands warm in our cold, cold Dakota winters. Well, since I live nearest to the Catholic Church here in DeSmet, I was elected to take care of our mitten tree. And I must say, the ladies have been bringing the most beautiful mittens for the boys and girls, and I'm sure all of the children will be very happy on Christmas Eve to be able to choose a lovely pair of mittens to wear this cold, cold winter. So you see, we have all sorts of folks who have moved here, who have emigrated from countries by all over. Let me see, we have the Procheskas, and they are from a place called Poland. And more folks from Poland are coming to live here and raise families. They've got beautiful farms. Now the Procheskas, they raise pigs and they make excellent ham. So I'm sure that there will be some families here in DeSmet who will be partaking of one of their wonderful hams for this Christmas dinner. Well, Mrs. Prochaska was telling me that they have some wonderful traditions of special foods for the Christmas season. She said one particular lovely tradition they have, it is an interesting tradition. She brought this with her today and showed it to me, and she thought you might be interested in seeing it. She sent away all the way to Chicago, and inside this envelope there are these little pieces of bread. It's much like the communion wafers you receive when you go to church. But they have little pictures on them of the family and Jesus and, of course, the star. And she said, during the Christmas Eve supper, the family will gather around the table. And each family member, even the children, if they have it, would receive a tiny little glass of wine to have with their wafer. And Papa would stand at the head of the table, and he would carefully break off a piece of this, and he would hand it to each after dipping it in some honey, and that person would hand it to the next and all around the table until the whole family had had a piece of the wafer. Now this wafer is called oplatki in her native language of Polish. And I thought, what a lovely, lovely testament to the celebration of the Christmas season, for it brings us all together. My husband always likes to say, my husband Charles, why, he likes to say, the only friends he doesn't have are the ones he hasn't met yet. And I look at that and I think about the Christmas season, and I think about the gathering of friends and family and loved ones, and a wonderful time it is to bring them together at that Christmas table. As I say, we have folks from all over the world who are coming here to live in America and to live in North Dakota. Sometimes our weather is not beautiful, but those folks who have come here, they marvel at the wide open spaces. They marvel at the fact that they're free and that they can purchase land and do their farming without paying the Lord of the Manor 3/4 of their wheat crop. And they are so pleased to be able to raise their children in such a wonderful free nation, to educate their children when they themselves did not have the opportunity for education. You know, before I married, I too was a school teacher, and my daughter, Laura, was a school teacher. So you see, we very much value education. We have a school here now in DeSmet, and that has attracted more and more families to settle here and to farm and to raise their families. We have a family here. I believe they're the only Greek family in the area. Their name is Christophilus. And the Christophilus family, why, they raise sheep. And it's not an easy process. I have learned so much from the family about the raising and the breeding of sheep. Now they have some of the sheep that are used for meat, and they have others that are strictly used because of their fine fleece, which will be made into beautiful wool and probably knitted in some lovely mittens. But the Christophilus family, they too have a very similar tradition as the Polish family does. They bake a very special bread, and that bread is baked in sort of a braid, and then it's made into a circle. And inside that bread, they place olives. Now, the lady of the house, Mrs. Christophilus, she told me it was very difficult to find olives in DeSmet, North Dakota. But fortunately, she was able to send away, all the way to St. Louis, for some pickled olives. And I haven't tasted them as yet. But she said they were quite dear, but it was absolutely necessary to have for their Christmas celebration. Those olives, they're chopped, and they are placed in the bread before it's baked. And then when they have their Christmas Eve meal, that bread will be blessed by Papa, and he too will break a piece of that bread off, handing a piece to everyone at the table. And they will say a prayer of thanksgiving for having arrived in this wonderful country, and that they have this beautiful Christmas feast ahead of them. And they also use olive oil all of their meals are somewhat tinctured, I should say, with the olive oil. It's something that you might have to get used to, but it is interesting. And as I say, I have learned so much from my neighbors. I've had a world tour just living here in De Smet. I'm not sure you're aware that my husband and I and our children have traveled quite a bit. Why, we started off in Wisconsin. In fact, I was born in Wisconsin, in Brookfield, Wisconsin. I was born there, and I met my husband in Concord, Wisconsin, and we married there. And we lived in Wisconsin for some time. 3 of our children were born in Pepin, Wisconsin. Oh, but my husband, he's had a wanderlust. Although he seems like he's settled and he's ready to stay here in De Smet. He's made many good friends here. He has a part ownership of a business here in De Smet. And he seems quite happy and satisfied to stay here in De Smet. And I must say that I am happy and satisfied to no longer be packing up every few months to go off to the Kansas territory or to Iowa or back to Minnesota or back to Iowa. I'm perfectly content here in De Smet. Well, as I was saying, we have folks who have come from all over the world. We have Russian families who have settled here. And just the other day, one of the ladies came so that I might sample a very special holiday treat, you might say, that the Russian families make. It's a soup. I'm not sure many of you have heard, we grow wonderful red beets here in De Smet, North Dakota. And this particular soup is made from red beets. I was rather skeptical until I tasted it, and it is quite divine. I was told that the beauty of this soup called borscht, it can be served hot or cold. And considering that Russia is a very cold country, I assume they often eat it hot. It is so splendid when served. A large dollop of sour cream is placed in the center, and oh, it is exquisite. And I felt quite naughty eating something so rich and tasty. As I say, the folks come here from all over the world. But oh, to think that I am now a grandmother. I don't think my little Laura will be quite up to celebrating the holiday with her new baby, and I definitely don't think she'll be baking any gingerbread this year. I'm sure we can make up for that. But I will have 2 of my daughters, my 2 youngest daughters, Grace and Carrie, will be with me. I don't think Mary will be coming home for the Christmas season. She is away at school, at a school for the blind in Iowa. And we're not so sure it would be a good idea for her to be traveling here home for the holiday season, but perhaps this summer she will be able to come and visit with us. But I've sent some parcels off to her with some little items that I've made for her, some mittens and some scarves and other little items that she might enjoy for the Christmas and, I hope, long after. But it's so wonderful to think of all these families gathering together from all these nations. Why, we have many families who have come here from Scandinavia. Now that's Norway and Denmark and Finland and Sweden. One of my neighbors, Mrs. Johansson, why, she came by just the other day. Now we're going to be taking this to the church on Christmas Eve, and we've decided that we'll raise some money by holding a raffle for this lovely tree. But this tree is made out of cookies. All of these sugar cookies of different sizes are lined up and topped by this little carved wooden star. And the ribbons are decorating the tree just in honor of the Christmas season. Now, Mrs. Johansson told me this is called a krumka. And she further told me that it is usually and often made for a wedding. Sort of a Scandinavian wedding cake, you might call it. If it is for a wedding, she said they decorate it with white ribbons and a wreath of flowers on top. But for the Christmas season, we've decorated it with these beautiful little ribbons, which Mrs. Jarsma was more than happy to donate from her husband's store. I don't know if Mr. Jarsma knew that. Well, she also told me some very interesting stories about Scandinavia. She's from Sweden herself. She told me that in every house in Sweden lives at least one little elf. And it lives in like the darkest corner of the house. And you never know if you really have an elf living in your house. And sometimes they can be quite mischievous. Oh, they could leave things out, or grandma's favorite teacup is broken, and well, of course the children will certainly blame the elf who lives in that corner back there. He's very mischievous. Sometimes there may be 2, 3, or more of these little elves living in your house. I haven't searched quite thoroughly here, but I haven't seen one in my house yet. But she told me sometimes these little elves, especially during the holiday season, they can be very helpful. But sometimes by the end of the long workday, just as you're ready to trudge off to bed, you think, oh, I really should have swept the floor before I go to bed, but, well, it will be there in the morning. And you wake up in the morning, and the floor has been swept clean, and the broom is put away, and everything is in order. Why, that is very lucky to have one of these little elves living in your house. However, there are some of these elves, as Mrs. Johansson tells me, some of the elves are spoon lickers. You never know when they've been licking your spoons. And so she cautions me that before using any spoon in the household that I wash it thoroughly, for one never knows when a spoon licker's been at his work. She also told me that there are pot lickers. Now this obviously is a very different type of elf. We might say a different breed of elf. Well, these pot lickers, why, you've got to be very cautious with the pot lickers also. Whenever you've made a lovely stew for the family and you've checked it 100 times and suddenly you come back and the pot seems to be empty, well, one can only attribute it to one of those little mischievous elves called a pot licker. And sometimes they're very helpful. Well, they've been known to sew buttons on your clothing and to mend clothing, even to leave you little gifts, especially during the Christmas season. So it's a very, very interesting little story that she had to tell me about these elves. And I suppose that, according to Mrs. Johansson, that just about every Scandinavian house from Denmark to Sweden and Sweden to Finland and on, they all have elves living in the corners. And she was telling me that maybe that is where we've come to this belief, you might call, of this fellow called Santa Claus. It seems as though that thread of tradition and the lovely little stories of the Christmas season, it's a thread that seems to run through so many nationalities, almost worldwide. I thought one was most frightening for me. We have an Italian family who has moved here recently, and the children were telling me about a fellow. He sounds rather villainous. He's called Black Peter. And during the Christmas season, he spies on children. And he can be seen late at night walking through the village with his donkey. And Black Peter carries a great big stick. And if any children happen to be acting a bit naughty during the Christmas season, apparently Black Peter comes over and gives them a few smacks with this huge stick to set them on the path of righteousness, I assume. But he sounded like a rather villainous fellow, but I suppose it's kept little Italian children in line and on their best behavior during the Christmas time. These are wonderful stories that have been handed down from mother to child and on and on. And there are so many families who have come here from England, specifically from a place called Wales. Well, we've got several families here. There's the Brumbaus and the Gogadars and the Jones and the Plish. Their name is Plish, John and Madeline Plish. And they come from a place called Wales. And they have some wonderful, wonderful traditions. Mrs. Brumbau was telling me just a few days ago, she brought me a gift of tea. Her mother from Wales, she sent her some tea as a Christmas gift. And it was just divine. I had never tasted such a wonderful tea. In fact, Mrs. Brumbau told me that her mother told her, well, this is third hand, may I point out, that that particular tea is a favorite of Queen Victoria herself. It was an exquisite cup of tea. Well, as I was saying, they have some wonderful traditions that go back years and years into the past, long before Christianity had come to Wales, when the people of Wales still believed in, the forest having spirits, that rivers were gods, trees were gods, and good and evil spirits lived all through the forest. And she said, to this day in Wales, people will go out of doors and they will decorate the trees during the winter solstice, the darkest, longest night of the year. They will decorate the trees with bright ribbons and feathers and all sorts of items to scare away the evil spirits lurk in that dark forest during the darkest day of the winter. And she said that one young woman in a village in Wales would be selected to be sort of an angel during that time, bringing cheer and light. And she would be dressed in a beautiful white garment with a wreath of holly. And she would be going from house to house and blessing those within. But Mrs. Brumbau also told me that long ago in the dark history of Wales, that young woman who was selected would eventually be sacrificed to the gods in the forest. Fortunately, that is something that has gone through the passage of time. The tradition of the young woman coming to each house, appearing as a beautiful angel of light, still persists in Wales today. And another one of my neighbors, now she is from Norway, and she told me that they make a very special rice pudding in Norway during the Christmas season. And within that pudding, one whole almond is placed in the pudding, and whomever receives that one almond at the dinner table on Christmas Day will have good luck for the rest of the year. And the ladies from Wales, they pointed out that there is a very similar sort of tradition in Wales and England and Scotland and Ireland. It is of a pudding. It is a plum pudding. And that too goes back long in the history of Wales and Scotland. It all began with oats. And the oats were placed in a pot with some suet, some nuts, and some berries. And this concoction was allowed to simmer on the fire for 7 days. And it had to be stirred every single day, just once. And you would never stir that pudding counterclockwise. It always had to be stirred clockwise so that you would not have bad luck for the rest of the year. And when that pudding is finally served, there is one coin, a gold coin, in the pudding. And I thought you might break your teeth on it, which wouldn't be lucky, but if you were to receive that one gold coin, you again would have good luck for the rest of the year. Why, we even have a family who came from a place called Louisiana, where I've heard it's quite warm. Now, this family from Louisiana, they have wonderful traditions. On Christmas Eve, early in the day, they place a long board on some sawhorses on the front porch of their house, and all sorts of wonderful meats and fish, and, well, some of them say they have even alligator meat, but I haven't seen any alligators in DeSmet lately. But they make a beautiful long buffet. They call it a groaning board. And they were telling me that this goes far back into the history of French Louisiana, and even before that, into France itself. And that idea of the groaning board, I read about that when I was a little girl. You see, when I was just a youngster, my family lived in Concord, Wisconsin. But I had a favorite uncle, my Uncle George Quitter. He lived in Watertown. And a couple of times a year, my family would go and visit Uncle George. And my Uncle George loved to read newspapers. Why, he would receive newspapers from all over the country, from Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, oh, everywhere you can imagine. And my Uncle George would save all of these newspapers. He'd have stacks and stacks of newspapers. And when we came to visit, just as we were preparing to go off home, Uncle George would come waddling out of the house with a huge stack of newspapers, plopping it into our wagon. I was so excited because I would have enough reading material for the rest of the year. And in one of these newspapers, it was a New York newspaper, I read about the Queen of England. And there were drawings of the Queen of England and her family in this newspaper, and how they celebrated Christmas in England. In fact, one of my neighbors from Wales was telling me that many years ago, you weren't permitted to celebrate Christmas in England. It had been outlawed. You could be arrested for eating a mince pie. But it was Queen Victoria who brought back the tradition of family and of the Christmas season. You see, her husband was from Germany, and he brought the tradition of the Christmas tree with him from his native Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. And I remember looking at those pictures and enjoying learning so much about Queen Victoria and the wonderful things in one of her castles. The following year, we came to visit my Uncle George in Watertown, and it was during Christmas season. And I walked into his house, and there in the parlor, on a table, was a little pine tree, all decorated with ribbons and pieces of candy and cookies and beautiful little angels and little gifts tucked underneath its branches. I was absolutely mystified at seeing a real Christmas tree at Uncle George's house. You see, my family, the Quitters, why, we hailed from New England. And my ancestors were Puritans. And they did not believe in the celebration of Christmas. In fact, when I was growing up, outside of going to Uncle George's, we never celebrated Christmas. It wasn't a day of worship. It wasn't a holiday. It was simply another work day. And so, when I came to Uncle George's house and saw that little Christmas tree, I was absolutely amazed that anything could be so beautiful as that Christmas tree. Well, I think it's a beautiful thing that we still celebrate the Christmas season. There are so many things that tear us apart. But this season seems to be one that will often bring us together. As my husband says, he doesn't have any friends that he has, the only ones that he doesn't have are those he hasn't met. And that is so true. It is so wonderful to be able to bring your family and perhaps those you don't even know, to bring them into your circle of family and friends to celebrate the Christmas season. I know I've kept myself quite busy with all of the decorating and the sewing and the knitting and the crocheting, preparing for this very special Christmas. And I remember reading about those Christmas stories in the newspapers. And I remember reading the British author, the English author, Charles Dickens, and the stories that he wrote about Christmas, about bringing together the miracles of the season that occurred. Sometimes little miracles and sometimes great miracles. Well, I think that I've learned to enjoy the Christmas season. I don't think I really missed it as a child because I didn't understand its meaning. But now, with the birth of my little granddaughter, I think it has given me a much greater sense of the importance of this season. And I know we will have such a wonderful Christmas with this new little gift of my baby granddaughter. Well, I suppose I should begin gathering everything up to take it over to the church and prepare for our event this evening, this Christmas evening. I think it's going to be wonderful to see the lights in the eyes of these little children when they select a beautiful pair of mittens from that tree. And I do hope that all your Christmases will be the very best, and all your future Christmases will be even better. And I thank you again, and I do hope before the light is gone that you make your way home. It does get very dark at this time of the year, and I do hope the weather holds for your travels. And thank you so much for coming to share a little bit of Christmas past here in De Smet, North Dakota. Thank you. Does anyone here have a special Christmas that they would like to share? I always love to ask that question. Nobody, you don't have a special Christmas, and then it's just you just sit under the tree waiting for Grandma to get run over by a reindeer. Is that it? Well, I think we've all had our highs and lows at Christmas. Sometimes we set our expectations up here, and they come in down here. I have one tradition at my house that I've been doing ever since I was a very little girl. I was very little. I was really just a baby when my father passed away. But a couple of weeks before his very last Christmas, I was about a year old. And my father had been diagnosed with cancer and had been under treatment for some time, and there really was no coming back. He knew the end was very near, apparently. I obviously don't remember. But one morning he got up and he told my mother that he felt really rather well, that he felt very strong and very, very vigorous. And he told my mother, he said, "Dress the baby. Get the baby dressed up. I'm going to take her shopping." And so my father took me shopping. And he took me to the most glamorous store in town, Woolworth's. Well, when you're a year old, it's pretty glamorous. You know, I probably was, you know, looking at, you know, everything that sparkled was catching my eyes. Well, I picked out two things. One is a red plastic bell, and the other is a red plastic bell, but it has a little sprig of artificial, it's plastic, mistletoe attached to it, and a little green elf sitting on top of the bell. So every year, as long as I can remember, and during my adult life, I have put that red plastic bell on my Christmas tree, and that little elf and the bell and the mistletoe, I hang in the hallway in the entrance to our house. So that has become a very important little Christmas tradition for our house, and I'm hoping when I am no longer here to celebrate Christmas, I do hope my daughters, I have 4 daughters, one of them will pick up and say, what the heck, what a cheesy crap little ornament is this? But it does go on my tree every year. Anyone else have some? Yes, I do.
Just good you remember something. Okay, I think he was Kris Kringle, I don't know. But I know it came from my grandparents' house, probably even before that. And my parents had it. It looks like Santa Claus, but it's not red, it's silver. And it's very old, you can tell it's very old. And every year it was on the Christmas tree, tied to not the bark, the stem, you know. It was always tied there, and it's still tied up. My sister.
That's a neat tradition.
Yeah.
And it's funny because sometimes you don't know where these things came from along the way, but it certainly is nice that it's been preserved all those years. So many things, you know, when a grandparent passes away, somebody goes, oh, there it goes, you know. And it's so nice to hear when something is preserved. I worked with elderly for many years, and one event that I held periodically during the year, and it was to spur their memory, to keep them thinking and remembering. And so at Christmas, I would always have sort of little cookie and coffee and tea and so on. We'd sit around for a couple of hours, and I would have them tell stories about growing up, or maybe what was the perfect gift that you received. And this one particular time we're doing this, and I had perhaps 12 or 15, because most of my residents were ladies. We had perhaps 12 or 15 that day, and they were all sharing their stories except one. And this one lady, she had grown up in Italy, and she was very beautiful, just exquisitely beautiful woman, and she was like 90 plus years old, but I can't imagine the showstopper that woman was when she was 20. She was just a beautiful, stunningly beautiful woman. And she would sit there and she'd listen and smiled when everybody was telling their stories. And I was concerned about her. So I walked with her to her room upstairs, and as we walked, I was asking, oh, you know, I was really surprised. I thought you'd have something to share. And she stopped and she got a little bit teary. And she said, well, all people were talking about the wonderful Christmases they had. One lady said she was happy, one of our ladies received a horse for Christmas from her parents. Well, that's pretty nice. And she said, I was so ashamed because I had nothing to share. And I said, you had nothing to share? She said, I grew up in a very, unbelievably poor circumstance in Italy. She said if we had food that day, we were pretty impressed. Our parents, they had nothing. And there was no work available. There just was nothing. We were just beaten down. And she said, I don't ever remember celebrating Christmas because we had nothing to celebrate. We had no food, no money. And she said, so I thought, well, that's just the way life is. She met a young man just after the Second World War, an American soldier, and they married, and she came here to the United States. And this was her second Christmas that she had been married, and at that Christmas she was going to have her husband's family come and she was going to make it an American Christmas. She said she went to the library and she read and she collected recipes and she tested recipes so that she could have this American Christmas. And the day came, it was Christmas Eve, the family, her husband's family was gathered, and her mother-in-law hated her. She hated this poor girl. She just disliked her for just on the premise that was it. I dislike you, I don't know you, but I still dislike you. And she said, so I was really trying to impress her, she said. Well, she impressed, everybody was really excited, everything was perfect. And then the time when people were handing out their gifts, and her mother-in-law handed her a beautiful, this most exquisitely wrapped box. She said she could still remember the silver tinsel and little flower. I mean, it was just gorgeous. She said you didn't even want to touch it, it was so pretty. But she opened the box, and inside the box was a filthy, dirty, food-stained, moth-eaten pink sweater. And she sat there, and she was a big person, this tiny little lady. She picked it up and held it up in front of everyone and said, oh, how lovely. It was so nice of you to think of me. I didn't expect a gift at all, but how kind that you would think of me. And she said, my mother-in-law sat there with a look on her face, that's not the reaction I wanted. But from that day on, her mother-in-law loved her and respected her. But I thought to myself, I would have just dove across the room and well, there is the door. Don't let it hit you when you leave. And don't come back either. And I'm not getting any leftovers either. You're not getting any. But you know, she was so grand in herself that she would do that. And her husband, he was so angry with his mother, and she's told him, she said, no. She said that she wanted to make a point, and I wasn't going to let her make that point. So, you know, I think to myself, well, when you sit and think, boy, I had a rotten Christmas, I think, wow, I think about this sweet lady, this beautiful woman who had to endure something so cruel. Nobody had a Christmas that was, wow, knock your socks off. Yeah, see, I knew there was one. She looks like a lady who had a good Christmas.
But I had to know, I went to a one-room country schoolhouse for 5 years, the only one in my class. I was the valedictorian, the dance, the everything. And our programs, you know, the week before we'd bring the boards and they'd make a little platform. Then they put the wire up, and they put the sheets on it. And we practiced and practiced, and we had to go downstairs in the basement, which who knew what was down there, until it was our turn. So we're up there singing, and my teacher comes over to me and she said, Susie, could you just mouth the words? Oh, she, oh. So I'm not, you know, I didn't join a choir or anything.
So from that day on, you said, oh, well, I guess Dolly Parton's going to have to take my place. Oh, that was a kicker.
But it was fun. I mean, you know, you have the those little curly candies, the wavy ones. You know, that many in a jar. Whoever guessed them got them. All the parents, the moms would bring box lunches. They would auction them off. And it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. The only time I probably ever had homemade or store-bought ice cream in my life. But
that's magnificent. Yeah, it's really amazing. We've had good Christmases, for the most part. The only bad Christmas we had was when one of my daughters became critically ill on the 21st of December. 31 days later, we brought her home from the hospital. So that was one of the, you know, and you know, I look back on that, you look at photographs, and you say, what the heck, I had dinner ready, and everything was just fine. I had cookies, and you know, and I spent, you know, every waking moment. One thing about my daughter, do you remember back in the 1980s, the Cabbage Patch doll craze, when they were just like, you know, really something? Well, my daughter Valerie, my third daughter, she was 11 years old then, and she became critically ill, was in the hospital. And 2 young college students were visiting from England. And they brought 2 dolls with them, signed by the guy who invented them, made by the guy who invented them. And they brought them to the hospital, and they asked the doctors and nurses, they wanted the sickest girl and the sickest boy. And my daughter won the prize. And so she was given the Cabbage Patch doll, whom she named, although it's a girl doll, and she named it George. And she still does have the doll with the box and everything today. But I mean, she was so sick, she really didn't care at the moment, but her younger sister was like, how come she got a doll? And my younger daughter's birthday was December 30th, which we spent at the hospital. So that was a tough Christmas. But other than that, I've had beautiful Christmases. But I do have that, I don't have any memory of my father, but I always have a reminder of how nice it must have been for me to go shopping that day. Apparently my mother had to fight with me to get my shoes on. She tried to explain, apparently. My mother explained things. Well, now, if we put these shoes on, then we can go someplace. But if you don't wear these shoes, you're not going. And you're already 10 months old. You should be understanding everything I'm saying. So get off that chair and put these shoes on. Yeah, that would be the discussion. But thank you so much. And do have a wonderful Christmas season. And we still do it. I know, especially women, I'm going to point you out. You know who you are. You could be 125, suffering from lumbago, flat feet, fallen arches, baldness, losing your eyesight, but by golly, you're going to have that Christmas dinner on time, and everything's going to be perfect. And anybody who says it isn't had better not show up. But thank you so much. Nobody has a big good story. What am I going to have if I don't have good stories? No, actually, I'm sure you all have wonderful, wonderful remembrances of Christmas. And we're lucky enough to have those beautiful memories on films and on, photographs. That I love looking at the old photographs with the Christmas trees that looks like somebody dragged it out of you ever see how scraggly these trees are, And I just go to the local place and say, oh, that one's only 100, well, I'll take 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're getting more and more expensive. But thank you so. How many people in here have a real tree? Oh, see, you hold on. That's good. I've never had an artificial tree, so I'll try and keep putting one up. But everybody else has one of those.
When my husband died, the first thing my son said was, we're still going to cut the tree. And
that is
now that I don't go
memory.
after it, he still cuts the tree.
But that's beautiful. That's a beautiful tribute and a memory. And it creates those memories that I think you keep. I
We
really do.
started cutting the tree in 1969. And we found a tree farm ever since.
We took our daughters to cut a tree. They put one downstairs, and they decorate the tree down there. And then we'd have the other one upstairs, but the girls decorated the tree. And we thought we were being so cute, we were going to take the 4 girls out, and they could pick out the tree and cut it. And once my husband started cutting the tree, they started to cry. We didn't know you were going to kill it. This is the way it is. It's the way of it's the circle of life, Birds are going to live in this tree after the Christmas season. But yeah, they stood there and they're crying. Oh, Daddy, you didn't tell us you were going to kill the tree. Oh, yeah. It's one of those dreadful things of Christmas. But thank you again. Please do travel carefully and do have a wonderful Thanksgiving is coming up, Christmas is coming up, and there aren't any more political ads for a while. I am so happy. Yeah, you just, you become mind numb to them. You don't even know what did he say? Who is that? I've never seen it before. But thank you so much. Do take care in your travels, and thank you.